Here we go. All right, so when we're talking about energy from biomass, we're kind of going back to where we were talking about like new carbon versus old carbon. So we've been talking about old carbon with coal, natural gas, and oil. All of that is carbon that is like ancient carbon buried under the ground millions of years. Energy from biomass, we're talking about biomass being wood, peat, charcoal, things like that. So what we're going to talk about here is we're going to talk about like what are the effects of using it? What kinds of pollution can we get from it? So we get this heat for energy at low cost, but we get all these pollutants. So we're going to talk about the pollutants. We're going to talk a little bit about deforestation, which we talked about way back in, I think, Unit 4. And then we're going to talk about ethanol instead of gasoline a little bit. So I've already kind of mentioned what is part of biomass. Now, remember, I want to remind you that when we're talking about when we're talking about biomass, we're talking about more modern carbons. We're talking about things that are going to just be part of that carbon cycle. When we burn it, they are producing carbon dioxide, of course, but also carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, particulates, and volatile organic compounds, because we're burning something that is not just pure carbon. If you burn something that is relatively pure carbon, like say methane, where it's just CH4, you're going to have a lot less of these other things coming off, because things like nitrogen oxides and volatile organics, they get released from burning things because of contaminants. These compounds contribute to indoor air pollution, especially in the developing world, and they can cause a lot of problems for people in the developing world, especially women, because most of this burning is happening in the home while women are cooking. And typically in the developing world, we're talking about a more patriarchal society with women doing the lion's share of the cooking. They're doing most of it. So a lot of times we see health effects, especially related to women and girls, because they are the ones expected to do the cooking indoors. Overharvesting of trees can also cause deforestation. It is not renewable if you are taking the trees faster than they can grow. So in some areas of the world, they might be harvesting at a sustainable rate, whereas in other areas, you might be harvesting too quickly. So it depends on what the local like economy of harvesting is. Typically, if the trees are being used just for energy, a lot of times then they are being harvested in a more sustainable fashion. It's only when they are then that lumber is also sold that we usually will see more deforestation, or if you have a population that has recently expanded. So if you have a growing population, you may see that they are using too many resources just because the number of people living there has expanded. All right, so modern carbon versus fossil carbon. I know I've mentioned this a couple times. Wood is better than burning coal because the carbon found in the biomass was in the atmosphere recently as carbon dioxide is taken in by the tree. So by burning it, we just are putting it back in the atmosphere. We're kind of continuing that cycle. There's no net increase in carbon. So we could call this carbon neutral. So even though we are putting some CO2 in the atmosphere, we would consider this carbon neutral because we're not adding any new CO2 into the atmosphere. Unlike when we burn a fossil fuel, we're taking the CO2 from under the ground, we're adding it to the atmosphere. Burning coal is that buried carbon. So that's going to increase our CO2 overall. This diagram kind of does a good job of explaining some of that. So you can see like where all of this carbon is. So the numbers are just to kind of give you an idea of like how much carbon you were going to find in different places based on, you know, kind of just scaling it so that you can kind of see comparisons. Human emissions are not that much, but those human emissions are additions to what we would normally expect in the carbon cycle. So it's throwing off the cycle. So even though the human emissions, it's only like 9, and then here we've got 120 for photosynthesis plus 3, and that's because of human additions that are causing more increase there. And you'll also see this 90 plus 2. So human emissions are putting in 9, but 2 of those 9 are going into the ocean surface. That's causing our ocean acidification. 3 of those are going to be used by photosynthesis. But that means that we are having 4, and again, this is kind of like not really a unit that we can talk about, because it's just kind of showing us in comparison. But we are having this increase over time as human emissions are added. All right. So when we talk about biofuels, we're talking about ethanol and biodiesel. These are used as substitutes for gasoline and diesel fuel. This is most of the way that we use biomass burning in the developed world. So in the developing world, a lot of times people are burning wood for cooking fires, or for heating their homes using like a wood burning stove indoors. Some people do that in the developed world as well. I know a friend whose brother lived in Appalachia and he didn't have like running water or like electricity. So he heated his home, and I mean, this was, you know, in Kentucky, I think, maybe Tennessee, but he heated his home with a wood burning stove. So there are some people who do this in the developed world, but like they are kind of more on the fringe of society. Usually they're people who don't want to participate in a lot of like the modern day things. Whereas in the developing world, it's basically the only technology available to most people. Now, when we talk about these biofuels, ethanol and biodiesel, these are going to be more high tech. So we don't usually see them used in the developing world. We see them used in the developed world. Ethanol is the same alcohol in alcoholic beverages. It's the same chemical structure. More than 90% of the ethanol created in the US comes from corn and corn byproducts. And that is because of our agricultural, like how we do agriculture in the US. We subsidize farmers to grow things like corn, because corn grows really well here, but then we need to use that corn for something. We grow way more corn than we would actually eat if we were just eating corn. So corn is used to make high fructose corn syrup, which is a sweetener that we use in many things. And it's also used to create ethanol. Biodiesel is a substitute for regular petroleum diesel. So these are two similar but slightly different chemically biofuels. The US government is actually encouraging the use of ethanol and biodiesel as a way to relieve our dependence on foreign oil while continuing to support the US farmers. This also makes those farm subsidies make a little bit more sense for the US. So we're going to kind of talk about ethanol first, and then we'll talk about biodiesel as well. The US is the leader in ethanol production. We make about 9 billion gallons or per year, at least in 2008. It's gone up a little bit since then. Brazil is the second largest producer of ethanol, but they use sugarcane to make it. So you don't have to make ethanol from corn. That's just what we have a lot of in the US, and it grows really well. Brazil uses sugarcane because, again, it grows really well there. It grows really quickly. The only problem is that sugarcane is replanted only 6 years, every 6 years, and it has to be harvested by hand. So Brazil is going to make it's not going to be able to like turn over those crops as quickly. So I think I said quickly. I meant not as quickly for the sugarcane. Corn grows really, really fast. In many places in the US, they can get like at least, they can get 2 harvests of corn a year. All right, gasohol is ethanol with like 10% ethanol in a gas ethanol mixture. You will probably be able to get this, like you may have put this in your car and not even known it. A lot of gas stations are now, they have gasohol as the default. And then you would get like E85 if you had a special engine. And the E85 is the 85% ethanol, 15% gasoline. The gasohol has a higher oxygen content than gasoline, so you get less pollution. You also are going to get less miles per gallon. So typically you're going to get a little bit fewer miles per gallon, which is why some people will preferentially try to go to gas stations that have pure gasoline. Because you're going to get a little bit better gas mileage. The E85 is only usable by flex fuel vehicles, but there are some other possibilities that may actually be better than using corn or sugarcane in the future. Switchgrass doesn't produce very many sugars. It needs a little bit more refining, but it grows really quickly and it's harvested really easily. The only reason we haven't grown switchgrass as a crop before is because you don't really eat it, right? Sugarcane and corn are both things that we eat that we've kind of converted into using for ethanol. Wood chips are another possibility if you have like recycled wood products, or even if you have like parts of trees that you've cut down for lumber that are not going to be able to be used for things like plywood or chipboard. You might be able to use those to make gasohol. All right, or ethanol specifically. Biodiesel is a substitute for petroleum diesel. It's typically diluted to B20, which is 80% petroleum, 20% biodiesel. So the B is the biodiesel part. You can also use in something that would take biodiesel, you can use SVO sometimes. That's straight vegetable oil. Typically, vehicles that use SVO, you use waste vegetable oil that has been strained and recycled. And you can get a kit for a lot of vehicles to like convert a car into taking SVO. And a lot of people will do that. A lot of like universities have done that with 1 or 2 vehicles as kind of a like sustainability like talking point, something to show that it's possible, because there's not that much waste vegetable oil that like everybody could drive a car that uses waste vegetable oil. Like there's only so many restaurants that fry things. But that's kind of the idea, is you take something that would go like in the trash and you're using it for this other purpose. Most biodiesel that we use comes from soybean oil or processed vegetable oil. So most of the biodiesel we're talking about is going to be just processed oils from either soy or vegetables. There are some alternatives. People are looking at certain types of algae that make more lipid, because when we're talking about the diesel, we want more lipids in the like starting material. So efficiency of transportation, because all of these things we've talked about are in vehicles, right? They're a liquid fuel, which means that they're very easy to be used in like a transportation kind of use. So public transportation is more efficient. Using just public transportation, no matter what kind of energy it's using, can save about 30% of your greenhouse gas emissions per year. Obviously, that's not necessarily going to be beneficial for everybody. Some people live, within a half a mile of MARTA stations, and it might be easy for them on most days to use public transportation. Some people do not, especially in Atlanta, where MARTA is not like everywhere. It's a little bit harder. In some places like New York, where you've got a lot of subway stations and they go all over, it might be easier. But then we also have like personal vehicles. Some of them are going to be more efficient than others. A hybrid is gasoline and electric, so it's going to get better gas mileage. Typically, it's about 53 miles per gallon in the city. That's a Toyota Prius from like 2 or 3 years ago. There's also plug-in hybrids, which rely more on electricity, but they also have gasoline, so you can go like further distances if you run out of like the electric charge. And then pure electric vehicles. These are even more efficient. Electricity in the all-electric vehicles results in emissions that are equal to about 100 to 120 miles per gallon, but it depends on where you're getting your electricity from, right? If you're getting your electricity from a coal-burning power plant, it's typically 100 to 120 miles per gallon. If you get your electricity from a power plant that is using like hydroelectric power, then you're making no emissions, or very, very few emissions. So we have to remember that those electric vehicles are not 100% clean. They're just clean at the point of use. In order to make electricity, we're doing something to get that electricity. Does that kind of make sense? All right, we will do some math next week to kind of look at how you would like calculate the different like amounts of energy usage and emissions kind of things in each different type of vehicle, like how efficient are they? All right, I want to talk about solar today too, try to get through the first one of our renewable sources so that we can kind of finish up hopefully tomorrow, and then maybe a little bit on next week. So solar energy, this is all the stuff we're going to be talking about, but I'm going to just kind of go down here and start going over the diagrams and the vocab. Solar energy, of course, is dependent on the cloudiness, the time of day, the season, and where you are. In Alaska, it might make sense to use a solar power plant in the summer, but definitely not in the winter because they don't get any sun. So some places are going to get sun for a good amount of the day year round. Atlanta, it would not necessarily be a bad thing in certain parts of Atlanta. But again, it's going to depend on like how much shade trees there are, things like that. Deserts are great because they don't have any like things shading it, and usually they get sun year round. Passive solar heating is where you don't use any pumps or mechanics to move the heat. So passive solar heating would be using a building kind of like Woodruff with all the nice windows, and then having tiled floors that retain the heat, so that during the winter you don't have to put out as much heat in your like from your electricity. Buildings like that would have these heat reactive tiles that would kind of suck in that solar energy through the windows, typically you're also going to have an overhang or different kinds of shades that you can use in the summer to prevent the sun from coming in the summer and raising the heat during the summer months. So that's kind of like a more passive kind of thing. Active solar energy is where you capture the energy of the sunlight with the use of either a pump or a photovoltaic cell, and you generate electricity from it. So passive solar energy is when you don't turn on the heat during the like end of the spring because you're getting enough warmth from outside. Active solar energy is where you actually use the energy from the sun to like turn on your laptop or charge your cell phone. There are also some solar water heating systems. My aunt and uncle had one in their house at one time where like the pipes, because they lived in Florida, for their hot water heater, it went from like their hot water heater up into the roof, so that during the summer you would get like extra hot water because it would be in the roof in these pipes. In the winter, you might have to like run the water a little bit longer to get it hot if it was cold, but it's Florida, so it's never really that cold. And then there's also this concentrated solar thermal electricity generation. We're going to talk about the photovoltaic systems and then this concentrated stuff too. Photovoltaic systems is probably the one you guys know of, so I'm going to skip down there and then we'll go up to the concentrated next. So photovoltaic systems, those are like the solar panels. Those convert sunlight into direct current. There's an inverter that then converts direct current into alternating current, and that supplies electricity to the house. Typically, any electricity that is not used at that location will then be added to the electrical grid, and it can be exported out to the other places in the grid. Benefits of this: no air pollution, no water pollution, no carbon dioxide. You get electricity when it is needed most in at least the South US on hot, sunny days. We typically use more electricity during the summer here than any other time, so that's great. Drawbacks: the initial cost to set up is relatively expensive. The panels themselves are expensive, not just the installation. Manufacturing the panels requires a lot of energy and water and involves a variety of toxic metals and industrial chemicals. Also, reclamation of the PV solar cells at the end of their lifetime can cause some environmental contamination. So this is a similar problem to what we talked about with the nuclear energy, where you have that toxic waste at the end. The lifespan used to be about 20 to 30 years. That's the number that is still in your textbook, but the technology for this is kind of growing right now. Last I saw, somebody was estimating 30 to 40 for some of the newer panels. So there are some advances happening in this regard. Concentrated solar power is what we see here. You've got a whole bunch of mirrors. The sun comes in and all those mirrors are angled towards this receiver. At that receiver, you're going to be heating up a liquid, which is going to become steam, and then you're going to use that to turn a turbine. After it turns the turbine, it goes back into here, condenses back into liquid, goes back into the receiver. So you have a heat absorbing fluid. It's not water. We don't usually use water for this. We use a liquid that is heat absorbing and that will turn into like a steam into a gas at a lower temperature. But yeah, we're using that, turning the turbine just like we do with like hydroelectric power or with a coal burning power plant. All right, any questions so far? Okay. Next is passive. So I already kind of gave an example with Woodruff. Passive solar energy can lower your electricity bill without pumps or mechanical devices. So basically building a house with windows along south-facing walls to help warm the house. Using special window shades to prevent the sun from coming in during the summer, but allow them to come in the winter. Using materials with a high thermal inertia so that they don't change temperature quickly, building into the side of a hill, or using a green roof, using better insulation. Another good example is the California Academy of Sciences. There's a picture of that building in your book, which uses a number of these things. Woodruff is a good example of it with all of the windows. You'll notice that the like overhead lights in the atrium in there don't come on very often at all because there's enough sunlight coming in, giving you a lot of that like light. So it's providing that light energy. Green buildings in general reduce the use of electricity, and there are passive house standards in Germany that require new homes to use at least some of these techniques. So techniques include no thermal bridges conducting heat through the walls, roof, or foundation. So you want to keep any heat inside the home. The roof and wall insulation is thick. Windows and doors are well sealed. If you've ever been in an older building, it's really cold near the window because they leak. They are not very well sealed. That was my dorm room when I was in college because it was built, like the building was built in like 1900 and something, like 1906. Heat exchangers can allow for more passive heating and cooling. Triple pane windows will reduce radiative heat loss, and then windows are positioned to accept the sunlight. So here's a bunch of those things. And I have focused in the text up here on the things that are related to solar. But in this picture, you can see there's even some other things like rainwater collection that can then be used for like watering the grass. You wouldn't want to use a rain barrel water for watering like a garden, but watering the grass would be okay, or flowers, just not something you're going to eat. Using not a lot of carpet because carpet has fibers that can give off certain gases. Using energy efficient windows, I think I talked about, low flush toilets. All of those things are part of this like green building. They don't all deal with solar energy, but yeah, some of them do. And I'm not sure what the safe room has to do with it. I am going to have to look that up at the website where I got the picture, because this picture had so many of the things I wanted to talk about, but I'm not sure why it has safe room there. So, all right, that's where we're going to stop. We'll pick back up with hydropower next time.